Alright, good morning, algebra. We're gonna continue on with quadratics, and we're gonna really look at the meat of the unit in terms of algebra itself. And we're gonna start looking at how to solve these types of equations. And they're gonna start off hopefully looking a bit like what you've done in the past. Hopefully, not too many steps. And we're gonna delve really in the next week or two into some really interesting ways of solving stuff. So I'm going to try to sort of give you a lot today and tomorrow that's similar to itself. But I'm going to try to give you a lot. So we're going to go through all these examples, and I want you to think about just these first few at first. So especially like 1 through like 4, really all of them, 1 through 7, and think about like what are the solutions to each of these equations? Like what are the things that make these equations true? And really just try to think of which ones you do know, which ones you don't know, and just think about how you get an answer. What kind of algebra steps can you do? So a lot of these, I think if you gave them enough thought, you could really figure out the solutions to them with or without my help or without quadratic equations at all. At least for the first few. Or probably all 7 of these if you give enough thought. So the first one should be pretty straightforward. X squared is 9. So really what we're doing here is we want to figure out what times itself gets you 9. And hopefully you figured out that 3 was a solution. And you also could figure out that -3 also works here. Because really what we're doing here is we are taking the square root of both sides. We took the square root of x squared, and we get the square root of 9 as well. Alright, so that's really what is happening in our equation. We're taking the square root to solve for x in this case. I'm just looking for the square button so we can refer to that. Let's see. Yeah. So really taking the square root of both sides. So like when you're solving an equation, you can either divide both sides by 2 or like add 2 to both sides. And here you're taking the square root of both sides. But when you do that, you sort of have to realize that there could be more than one like possible thing that might work. So in this case, you have +3 or -3. So we have this cool little symbol that we use right here. You guys seen it before. This symbol is it's a plus sign on top of a minus sign, and that's really you just call it sort of the plus or minus symbol. It doesn't have a very nice name, and it really just means that x could be positive or -3. We're gonna try to get used to writing that. Just get used to what that means. All right. I don't know if there's a way for you guys to type that on Google Forms. You won't be required to type it. You could just say x is 3 or x is -3 if that's your question. All right. And then, okay, so now we have x squared is 0. So what number times itself gets you 0? And that number is 0. And do we need the plus or minus? In this case, we don't say that x equals plus or minus 0 because -0 is the same as 0. All right, so we just say x equals 0 in this case. There's no other number that works. All right, now for number 3. X squared minus 1 equals 3. So now we're kind of getting back into our equation solving steps, where our goal is really to isolate the x squared. So we want to get the x squared by itself, or figure out what must that unknown quantity be to make my equation true. So really we're like, all right, what would I take 1 away from to get 3? And that answer is I would take 1 away from 4 to get 3. So x squared has to be 4. So what number times itself gets me 4? And that would be 2 or -2. Or I could just say x equals, where's my symbol? Oh no, hold on. I could say x equals, and I'm more familiar with Microsoft Word for this, that's why I'm choosing this. X equals positive or -2 for that one. All right, I can write my solution like this, or I can write it like this. I'm not picky. We're distance learning. We're just, as long as we understand that I could get a positive or a negative, because -2 times -2 also gets me 4. All right. So now here, same type of deal. We have a step to do before I can take my square root. So I have 2x squared gets me 50. So if I divide both sides by 2, I know that x squared itself has to be 25. And what times itself gets me 25? Well, that has to be 5 or negative 5. So I got plus or minus 5 there. All right. And the next one, this looks like, ooh, we got factored form going on here, which is very beneficial. Because in factored form, we use what's called the zero product property that tells us that two things that multiply to get you 0, one of them's got to be 0. So either x plus 1 has to be 0, or x plus 1 has to be 0, right? So if x plus 1 is 0, x has to be, you guessed it, negative 1. All right? So notice that one only had one solution, all right? Because that was like one of those graphs where it had the same factor listed twice, so there's only one possible 0. All right? And then number 6, another factored form, x times the quantity x minus 6 equals 0. So in this case, either x equals 0 or x minus 6 equals 0. And in that case, so we'd say x equals 0, or, and I'll just insert another equation down here, why not? Or x equals 6, because 6 minus 6 gets me 0. Let me throw that in red too. So those are my two solutions. So notice in this case, this is our first one where our solutions are both like, it's not just plus or minus, it's two distinct numbers. And that's going to happen a lot, which is okay. So you have x equals 0 and x equals 6. So if I plug in x equals 0, I'd get 0 times negative 6 equals 0. And if I plug in x equals 6, I would get 6 times 6 minus 6 is 0. So 6 times 0 gets me 0. All right. And then for number 7, I have x minus 1 times x minus 1 equals 4. Now notice this one is equal to 4. So it's not going to be the same sort of cut and dry process here. So this one is one that we would spend a little bit more time on in the future. But here, you notice that it's the same factor twice. X minus 1 times x minus 1. So it's really x minus 1 squared gets me 4. And what number squared gets me 4? That number is either 2 or negative 2. But notice those aren't my answers. Those are not the answers. And if I plug in 2 here, so 2 minus 1 is 1. 2 minus 1 is 1. 1 times 1 isn't 4, notice. So that's because the 2 is this whole thing. X minus 1, in this case, would have to be 2. Or x minus 1 would have to be negative 2. So let's say x minus 1 equals 2. Or x minus 1 has to equal negative 2. All right, so then I would solve this equation and solve this equation. And I know this looks like a lot now. That's probably because it is. But it's something we're going to get used to. Don't worry, don't feel too crazy about it yet. So if x minus 1 is 2, x has to be 3, or x minus 1 equals negative 2, so add 1 to each side, or x equals negative 2 plus 1 is negative 1. So x is 3, or x equals negative 1. And the word or is actually important. It wouldn't be and, because x can't be two different things at once. It could be either one of those two things, though. It could be one or the other, but not both at the same time. And I could check my solution, because, all right, 3 minus 1 is 2. 3 minus 1 is 2. Oh, yeah, 2 times 2 is 4. And negative 1 minus 1 is negative 2. Oh, negative 1 minus 1 is negative 2. And negative 2 times negative 2 gets me 4. All right? So there's the first part. Can you believe they had this as the warm-up? This could have gotten us through like most of a class and like similar problems to this. So hopefully that made sense. Hopefully that was pretty helpful. Hopefully you have your own strategy as well. Don't feel like you have to mimic my strategy yet. Especially for the first few, you could probably number sense, reason it out. A lot of you are great at that kind of problem solving. Don't give that up just because I might not be thinking the same way. All right, I would love to hear all your strategies in school. Unfortunately, I cannot. Okay, So we're going to do a little bit more practice over here on this page. We're going to see how far we get. All right. So each of these equations has two solutions. So quadratic equations do often have two solutions. And sometimes they don't have any solutions. And we'll talk about that hopefully before I finish this class today, because you will need it for your exit slip. So each of these equations has two solutions. So try to find both of the equations, or both of the solutions for these equations. And think about how you would get the exponent term, the n squared, by itself on each side. All right? So think about that first step. How would you solve for the n squared? If you haven't already, it's a good time to pause, give some of them a try. Okay, so again, we thought about how would we solve for n squared, just that first piece first, or how would I solve for the n quantity squared? So that's an important piece of the puzzle, is solving for that. All right, because then you have to deal with that a couple different ways later. So the first one, n squared plus 4 equals 404. So we can solve that. Hopefully we all are familiar by subtracting 4 from each side of my equation. And that gets us n squared equals 400. And then I know you're thinking, you're like, I don't know what multiplies by itself to get me 400. And I don't know what the square root of 400 is. But luckily, we have a wonderful friend called Desmos who can help us. Square root of 400 gets us 20. So that is our solution. So let's go back to our assignment. So n can be 20 or negative 20, because negative 20 also multiplies by itself to get us that. So I could say that n equals plus or minus 20. All right. Now, in a perfect world, we'd have games in class to help us remember our perfect squares and our perfect cubes and our roots and stuff like that, but oh well, maybe next year. So, next problem. 432 equals 3n squared. So my first step here, again, would be to divide both sides by 3. And then when I'm done with that, when I do, that's the wrong tab, sorry. That's for Math 8. When I do 432 divided by 3, I get 144. And then I can do the square root of 144, and I can write it properly. And I get 12. Or is that also a perfect square? All right. Yeah, so square root of 144 is 12. So again, I'm left with my plus or minus 12. And next one, again, I'm solving for my n plus 1 squared, but that one's already solved for. So notice if I just took the square root from here, if I just did the square root, I could say that 12 equals n plus 1, but I also have to think about it equaling negative 1. All right, so I have to consider one option and the other. Because I know that plus or minus 12 squared gets me 144, that means that my answer is not plus or minus 12. N plus 1 has to be plus 12 or minus 12. That's kind of the important part there. And it'll take some getting used to. All right, but really just recognizing that n plus 1 is plus or minus 12. I guess I'll write that in the next line too. So I'll write n plus 1 is equal to not infinity, plus or minus 12. So then I have two different cases to look at. I have to look at the n plus 1 could be 12, or n plus 1 could be minus 12. So let's see, I've already got that written right above. So I could say n equals 11, or n equals -12 minus 1 is -13. All right, so I could write it like that. Those are my two n values there. Okay, so then our last one, I'm not going to type an equation here. Our last one, again, add 30 to both sides, we get n minus 5 squared is 100. And then n minus 5 has to be plus or minus 10. So n minus 5 could be 10, or n minus 5 could be negative 10, because again, 10 squared is 100, or negative 10 squared is 100. So if I do that, I get n equals 15, or n equals, let's see, negative 10 plus 5 is negative 5. All right, so there's my two solutions there. All right, so I think this is about as far as we would get in a live lesson. I can't imagine getting much farther than this in a live, because this has already been 20 minutes, and lives take a lot longer. So let me just throw, we're going to skip the are you ready for more for now. We don't need that, but I do want to put it in the next lesson. So really quick, the summary is this is actually a very good summary because it has a different problem in it you can look at. So this problem, I can even throw this in the exit slip maybe to make sure you actually follow this problem. So to solve this equation, you add the 75 to both sides and it turns into this. All right, it was written to be solved for 0. So we added 75 to each side to get this. And then here they divided each side by 3. You got x plus 1 squared is 25. And what can be squared to get 25? The two numbers that work are 5 or negative 5. So whatever's in those parentheses has to be either 5 or negative 5. So that means that x plus 1 has to be 5, or x plus 1 has to be negative 5. So if x plus 1 is negative 5, then x is negative 6. But if x plus 1 is 5, then x is 4. All right, so I'm obviously going to send this to you. I'll have all my notes in here for you guys to look at. Hopefully you're able to do this part of it. Hopefully that wasn't too crazy. And that should be all. Enjoy your day.